I was halfway through unpacking boxes when I found the envelope that ended everything. The movers had just left, and I was still in my work clothes, sweating through a dusty t-shirt, barefoot on the tiled floor of our new desert house. Evan was supposed to meet me there that evening. This was our fresh start, he had said. A small adobe-style place near Sedona, with cactus plants in the yard and endless red sky out the back window. He wanted space, peace, a break from the city. I gave up everything to follow him here. The envelope was tucked inside his old jacket, the one I had nearly tossed into a donation bag. Something made me check the pockets. It was unmarked, just sealed with a firm crease. I opened it without thinking. Inside was a handwritten letter on soft pink paper, folded neatly in two. The handwriting wasn't mine. It wasn't his either. I read the first line and felt my stomach drop. I can't stop thinking about last weekend. My hands trembled. I scanned the rest, words jumping out like sparks from a fire. Your voice, your hands, the way you said my name. Then near the end, tell her soon. She deserves the truth. I stood there frozen, the letter fluttering in the hot breeze from the open window. My mouth went dry. I sat down on a box labeled kitchen and read it again, slower this time. The words didn't change. I didn't cry. Not right away. I went outside and walked around the side of the house, where Evan had talked about putting a hammock. The sun was still high, and the light made everything feel fake, like I was standing in someone else's life. I stared out at the hills and tried to remember when I had last felt close to him, truly close. I couldn't. Evan arrived that evening with takeout and a tired smile. He kissed me on the cheek and talked about the drive and how the internet guy was coming Tuesday. I listened without speaking. I waited until he set the food down on the kitchen counter and opened the bag. Then I put the letter in front of him. He looked at it, then at me. No confusion, no lies, just silence. I watched his face as he folded the paper again. He set it aside gently, as if it might explode. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. I didn't want you to find out like this. That was it. No denial, no excuse. I didn't shout. I didn't ask him who she was or how long it had been. I just picked up my keys and walked out of the house barefoot. The gravel hurt, but I didn't stop. I got in my car and drove until I couldn't see anything familiar anymore. I ended up parked on the side of a narrow road that curved along the edge of a canyon. The sky had turned a deep purple by then, and stars were beginning to show. I sat with the windows down, the warm air sticking to my skin, and finally let the tears come. They didn't feel sharp. They felt slow and tired, like something old finally breaking. Just before we continue, I'd love if you could subscribe. It helps me share more stories like this. That night, I didn't go back. I booked a motel in Cottonwood with a broken ice machine and a thin sheet that smelled like lemons. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing the words of that letter again and again in my head. I had loved him. I had trusted him. I had followed him across states, changed jobs, changed dreams, and now I had been replaced like an old couch that no longer fit the room. In the days that followed, I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister, not my best friend back in Nevada. I didn't want to hear their sympathy or their anger. I didn't want anyone to ask why I hadn't seen it coming. Maybe I had. Maybe deep down, I had felt the distance growing for months. But I had ignored it, thinking that love meant wading through the rough patches. I thought it was just stress, or work, or the move. It wasn't. He called me twice that week. I didn't answer. He left one message, calm, apologetic, weak. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't say he had ended it with her. He didn't promise anything. That hurt more than anything else. It was like he had already closed the door and walked away. He had made his choice. All I had now was the echo of it. I moved into a short-term rental on the edge of town. It had a view of the rocks and a sagging couch, but it was mine. The neighbors were quiet. There were hummingbirds in the morning and coyotes at night. I started waking up early, drinking coffee on the back steps with a blanket around my shoulders. I watched the light change on the cliffs and tried to remind myself that I was still here, that I was still real. Sometimes I thought about calling him, not to fix anything, but just to hear the truth from his mouth. But then I remembered how quickly he had let me go, how easily he had moved on. I began walking the same trail every evening, a loop behind the neighborhood that wound through the desert brush and dipped into a dry riverbed. It was quiet, and I liked the rhythm of my steps on the dirt. One evening, I passed a couple sitting on a rock, sharing a bottle of water. The woman leaned her head on the man's shoulder. I looked away quickly and kept walking. I was tired of being invisible, tired of feeling like a placeholder in someone else's life. I wanted to stop thinking about him, about her, whoever she was. I didn't want to picture the two of them in the house we were supposed to share. I didn't want to imagine her wearing my robe or drinking from the mug I bought in Oregon. But those thoughts came anyway. I spent that first month learning how to be quiet with myself again. I took long drives with the windows down, listened to old music, cooked for one. I bought a plant and named it for no reason. I wrote in a notebook without thinking too much. I looked at the sky a lot. One morning, I realized I hadn't cried in 5 days. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized. Tired, yes, but stronger. I had been broken open, but not destroyed. That was the start of something. It surprised me how much silence could heal. The quiet of the early morning, the stillness between footsteps on the hiking trail, the way my phone no longer lit up with messages from him. It all gave me space I didn't know I needed. At first, the silence was painful. It reminded me of what was missing. But over time, it started to feel like peace, like freedom. I had spent so long adjusting my voice to keep someone else comfortable that I forgot how to hear myself think. In that little rental house on the edge of town, I began making routines. Nothing fancy. I watered the plant every Tuesday. I went to the same corner grocery store every Saturday morning. I started buying fresh lemons, something I never did before, and squeezing them into cold water because I liked the clean taste. I found a small library and got a card, even though I hadn't read for pleasure in over a year. I picked up books at random. I didn't look for meaning in them. I didn't underline anything. I read like someone relearning a forgotten language. Some evenings, I watched the sun fall behind the hills with a cup of tea in hand, reminding myself that I was allowed to feel tired and still be okay. The strangest part of it all was that I stopped thinking about Evan every hour. Then it became every day. Eventually, I went a whole week without remembering the exact sound of his laugh or the way he used to press his hand to the small of my back in crowded places. That realization came suddenly, and I didn't know whether to feel proud or ashamed. Maybe a little of both. I had loved someone with my whole being, and he had chosen someone else. And somehow, I was still here. But the hardest part wasn't forgetting him. It was forgiving myself for staying so long after the love had started to fade. I had noticed the way he stopped asking me how my day was, the way he scrolled through his phone during dinner, barely listening, the way he never reached for my hand anymore unless someone was watching. But I told myself it was stress. I excused it with long explanations and longer hope. I wanted to believe that we were just going through a phase. I had convinced myself that if I loved him enough, if I stayed patient, everything would return to the way it once was. Now, I saw it more clearly. Evan hadn't changed overnight. He had slowly stopped choosing me, little by little, one forgotten moment at a time. And by the time he fully stepped away, I had already been standing alone for months. The difference now was that I finally saw it, and I had stopped standing still. One afternoon, I drove into town for a haircut. It was something I hadn't done in ages. I had always worn my hair long because Evan liked it that way. But now, sitting in the salon chair with a breeze from the ceiling fan brushing my face, I asked the stylist to cut off most of it. She didn't ask why. She just nodded and started snipping. When it was done, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. It wasn't a dramatic cut, but it felt like shedding old skin. It felt like claiming something back. Myself. As I walked out, I noticed a man sitting at a cafe table near the door, sketching in a notebook. He glanced up, smiled briefly, then went back to his drawing. Nothing about the moment was romantic or meaningful. But I smiled back, and that small, human connection, a stranger acknowledging my presence, felt like a step back into the world. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't forgotten. I was still someone. That evening, I wrote in my notebook again. I didn't write about Evan. I didn't write about the woman he chose instead of me. I wrote about the sky, about the feeling of wind moving through shorter hair, about the way the woman at the grocery store had said, "You look brighter this week." I described the feeling of sitting alone and not feeling lonely, and I started to believe that maybe I was changing. Slowly, gently, but clearly. The next few weeks passed in soft motion. I still had hard days. Days when I heard a song that reminded me of our road trip through Utah. Days when I passed a couple in a store aisle and felt the sharp pang of what I no longer had. But those moments didn't knock me down like they used to. They came and went like passing clouds. I learned to let them pass without holding on. Then, one afternoon, I saw him again. It was at the farmer's market of all places. I had just picked out a jar of local honey and was turning toward the flower stand when I saw Evan. He was holding a small paper bag and talking to someone. At first, I couldn't see her face. Then she turned slightly, and I knew. Brooke. She was prettier than I expected. Not loud, pretty, or polished. Just soft, relaxed, confident. She touched his arm as she laughed. He leaned in, smiling like someone who had never tasted heartbreak. They hadn't seen me. I stood behind a small rack of handmade soaps and watched them for a few seconds that stretched too long. Then I turned and walked the other way. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel anger. I felt something quieter, like watching the final scene of a movie I had already accepted the ending of. I had imagined this moment in so many painful ways, but the truth of it was almost peaceful. He had moved on, and so had I. Back at home, I sat on the porch and looked out over the quiet road. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long orange shadows. I sipped water from a chipped glass and let the moment sink in. I had seen him. I had seen her, and I was still breathing. Not broken, just real. Just me. That night, I opened my old laptop and wrote an email. Not to Evan, to myself. I wrote about the letter I had found, the moment he confessed, the silence that followed. I wrote about the way I had started rebuilding piece by piece through lemons and library cards and walks at dusk. I wrote it all down, not to hold on to it, but to let it go. The act of writing it was enough. I didn't need anyone else to witness it. It was my own way of saying goodbye, not to him, but to the part of me that had kept waiting. When I was finished, I didn't press send. I just saved it, closed the laptop, and went to bed. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep quickly. My dreams were light and quiet, like pages turning in a soft breeze. And when morning came, I didn't think of him at all. The following weeks felt like walking out of a fog and discovering new paths where I had never dared to look before. Each day had a quiet rhythm. It was not exciting, it was not dramatic, but it was mine. I began to understand that healing doesn't look like a single moment of strength. It looks like doing the same small, quiet things every day until they stop feeling painful and start feeling natural. I took longer walks now, often without a clear destination. Sometimes I brought a notebook. Sometimes I didn't. There was a small bench near the edge of a rock formation where the wind always blew a little cooler. That became my thinking place. I didn't go there to plan or to remember. I went there to sit, to be still, to feel like a person again. I liked watching the way the light moved across the red earth, how the color of the landscape changed slowly through the day. Arizona had a way of reminding you that nothing stays the same, not even the rocks. At work, I stopped avoiding conversations. My coworkers noticed. I smiled more, asked more questions, even joined them once for lunch at a nearby diner. I didn't talk about Evan. I didn't talk about the past. But I listened. I was present. And for the first time in a long time, I felt part of something again, even if it was something small. One morning, I found a list I had written months ago, tucked into an old journal. It was a list of things Evan and I were supposed to do in our new life. Buy a grill, hike to the top of Cathedral Rock, start a garden, host a housewarming. I read the list slowly, letting each line sink in. These had been my dreams too, and yet, looking at them now, they felt like someone else's handwriting. Not because they weren't real at the time, but because I wasn't that same person anymore. I didn't throw the list away. I folded it back into the journal and set it aside. Maybe one day I'd write a new list, one that had nothing to do with proving I was lovable or worthy, one that was about living, not performing. I didn't want to be a name on someone else's plan again. I wanted to build something that was entirely mine, even if it was small. Not long after, I joined a weekend pottery class in town. It was something I had always wanted to try but never made time for. I felt awkward at first. My hands didn't move the way I wanted them to. The clay spun and wobbled and collapsed more times than I could count. But the instructor smiled and said, "That's how it goes. You mess up, then you shape it again." There was something gentle in her words that stayed with me. At the end of the session, I had made a lopsided bowl with uneven sides. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine. I brought it home, cleaned it carefully, and set it on the shelf by the window. Every time I looked at it, I felt proud. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Made with effort. Made through mistakes. Still standing. That little bowl reminded me daily, not everything beautiful has to be symmetrical. Not everything whole has to be flawless. Sometimes I thought about Brooke, but less than before. I wondered what her days looked like, if she and Evan shared morning coffee, if they decorated the bedroom the way I once imagined we would. But those thoughts didn't last. They floated in and out like birds that didn't stay. I didn't hate her. I didn't even envy her. I had no idea what her story was, and I no longer felt like I was a character in it. She was simply someone who had entered a moment of my life and now belonged outside of it. One afternoon, I received a letter from my older sister back in Nevada. A real letter, handwritten, with a photo of her 2 kids included. She had written, "We miss you. When you're ready, come visit. The guest room is waiting." It made me smile, and then it made me cry. Not out of sadness, but from a kind of relief. I had drifted so far into my own loneliness that I forgot people were still waiting for me outside of it. That letter felt like a light being turned on in a room I had locked for too long. I called her the next day. We talked for over an hour. She told me stories about the kids and her chaotic mornings. I told her about my pottery class and the little bowl that now sat by my window. I didn't tell her everything, but I didn't need to. She listened. I felt heard. I felt like someone's sister again. And more than that, I felt like myself again. Messy, honest, and still trying. That call opened something up in me. I began reaching out more. Old friends, cousins, even my mother, who I hadn't called in months. I started making plans to visit, not because I needed to escape, but because I was ready to reconnect. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live again, piece by piece. Then, one morning, I woke up with a new thought. It came like a whisper, gentle but firm. I didn't need closure from Evan. I didn't need answers he hadn't given. The closure had already happened. In the quiet mornings, the red skies, the chipped bowl by my window. I had closed the chapter by living the pages that came after. That was the part no one tells you about moving on. It doesn't happen when you get the apology. It happens when you stop waiting for one. That afternoon, I packed a small bag and drove north. I didn't tell many people. I just needed to go somewhere that reminded me who I was before I met him. I stopped at a tiny roadside diner near the state line. It was old, the kind of place with creaky booths and faded menus. The waitress smiled like she knew the value of silence. I sat near the window and ordered coffee. While I waited, I pulled out my notebook. I wrote the first line without thinking. I was never too much. I was never not enough. I was just with someone who couldn't see me. The words came easily after that, not because I was full of wisdom or because everything made sense, but because I was finally writing for me. I wasn't trying to understand him. I wasn't trying to rewrite the past. I was simply telling the truth as it had felt to live it. That truth wasn't perfect. It was layered with doubt and guilt and love and loss, but it was mine. And claiming it felt like standing in the sun after too long in the shade. And somewhere between coffee refills and the hum of old country music on the radio, I realized I was okay. Maybe not fully healed, maybe still rebuilding, but whole, and no longer waiting to be chosen.